Hello, this is Reasonable Faith, and welcome to our talk today. Unlike other religions, the Bible records God's actions in history, and so the Bible's historical reality is vitally important to its validity. So, is the Bible historically reliable? And our speaker tonight on this subject is Trevor Harris. And Trevor has an honours degree in architecture and a master's degree in urban and regional planning. And he has practiced in these areas for 45 years. But 20 years ago, he formed a company called Keyline Christian Research, dedicated to identifying and researching Bible sites and their history. And this has included extensive field trips to the Middle East, all of which is influencing what he has prepared for us tonight. So hand over to you then, Trevor, and we'll get this slideshow underway.
Thank you, Brian.
Where is that?
So by way of introduction, a personal comment on the topic, and that is when I was newly converted 58 years ago, I asked the minister of the church, why are we looking at the Old Testament? We're a modern church, shouldn't we just stick to the New Testament? To which he gave me a grin and said, Trevor, you've got to realise that foundations are very important to understand all the modern. And that started my journey on the topic. And the question we ask, of course, when we say, is the Bible historically reliable? It's what Bible am I referring to in this study tonight? And the Old Testament, as many of you would know, has two main versions. And they all come from the original Hebrew copies that were passed down. And the first one is the Hebrew Bible, which is also called the Masoretic text, which we will be referring to tonight. And the oldest copy of a complete version of that is the Leningrad Codex, dated to 1000 AD, not 900 as I've got there. And the Greek Septuagint in the years 250 to 132 BC was when a group of rabbis in Egypt translated their Hebrew texts into a Greek version, which was a very revolutionary document in that it meant that Gentiles could now read all the books of the Old Testament, a profound development. For Christians, we have three main traditions with Bibles. The Orthodox edition of the Old Testament has used the Septuagint and has 49 books. There's the Catholic edition, which uses the Masoretic with 46 books, and the Protestant edition has 39 books. When we come to the New Testament, all traditions agree on the 27 common books and the Greek text. This occurred over a period of time, and as there was initial debate on which ones were to be included, by the 2nd century, all those 27 books were known. And it's not in the scope of this talk to critique all the variations of Bibles that are available and not to debate the Apocrypha. So in summary, I'm looking at the Protestant Bible, which most of us use, with its 66 books as the reference. Now, a few scriptures on what the Bible actually says about itself and history. And there's the Colossians quote, which says it's to be Christ-centered. And it says Christ, or Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So this is a powerful principle that we should affect how we consider the proposals of history. Then we have Jesus's statement to the two disciples going to Emmaus, and he says, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he, that's Jesus, interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So the challenging claim being made here, it affects all insight into the Old Testament. And regarding prophecy, knowing that, first of all, no prophecy of scripture comes from someone's own interpretation, for no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. So the God-inspired source of all historical prophecy is profound. Then we have Paul addressing the Greek scholars in Athens, and he said to them, and he has made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God. Again, a very powerful affirmation of the common ancestry of humans. Then we have in Isaiah, who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, the first, and with the last I am he. So the earth has a divine beginning and a divine end. Then another Isaiah says, declaring the end from the beginning and the ancient things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose. So every stage of human history is known by God, both before and after. And this reveals the prophetic dimension in the Bible. So we look now at this evolving Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, as it's called, Tanakh is an acronym, took over 1,000 years to write. So one of the first claims are made is, how do we know it's reliable if it's many authors over a long period of time? A fair enough question, but we have to look into it more carefully why we believe it's reliable. And that is this incredible copying tradition that was there from the very start. For many centuries, the texts were copied by hand by scribes, so the propensity for an occasional error could occur. But the copying tradition was very exact and methodical under strict Hebrew guidelines. They had rules for checking and counting all the letters. Jewish historian Josephus stated regarding their scriptures, what faith we placed in our own writings is evident in our conduct. For though so long in time has now passed, no one has dared to add anything to them or alter anything in them. Now, an interesting confirmation of all this happened when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. Many historic fragments of copied Bible texts were found dating from 200 BC to 70 AD, and they included parts of all the Hebrew books except the book of Esther. As they were examined, it was revealed that many of the texts were very similar to 7th century editions that had been produced. And there's the famous example of the large Isaiah scroll that was done in 125 BC, was found to be very, very similar to a copy of a 1920 AD Aleppo Codex. Less than 1% of errors or spelling errors and so forth in the comparisons. So in the time of copying in that document, which is over 1,000 years, the margin of error is extremely small, and many of it's quite insignificant, actually. Then we have the question of the developing scripts. These are the alphabets that were the product of a long process over time to create the words that were read in the Hebrew scriptures. This again has raised questions about the reliability of some of the word meanings, and some variations in letters can affect an interpretation. But this is true of all languages. Bible scholarship has a long tradition in seeking text reliability. The original Hebrew language is linked to what's called the Proto-Canaanite script that's connected with the Phoenicians. There is debate as to which came first. Some scholars actually propose that the Hebrew came first. Joshua's conquest of Phoenicia in 1445 BC shows the early interaction of the two cultures. It has also even been suggested that Joseph in Egypt may have had a hand in developing the early fonts. Needless to say, it has to be a script that Moses was well acquainted with. And of interest today is the revival of the modern Hebrew language from what they called a dead liturgy, where they struggled to understand its modern application. A scholar back in the 19th century took on the challenge and developed a modern Hebrew language to relate to the original writings. And every year in Israel, they celebrate Hebrew Language Day. They see it as a great achievement in the founding of their nation. And our alphabet is derived from the Proto-Canaanite and Phoenician alphabets, followed by the Greek. And these alphabets and its derivatives are a huge contribution to humanity. And I must also add, it's been greatly used in the promoting of God's word around the world. Then there's questions of interpretation, because all cultures have languages that have meaning, but when they're translated into another tongue, the challenge is to keep the original understanding. This can lead to differences of opinion. Both the Hebrew, Greek, and our English versions have a long history of dedicated scholarship that gives confidence in assessing biblical texts. Some differences are the spelling, and some can be the author's context. But most of any claimed contradictions can be explained. And in my journey with that, in researching contradictions, there are many good explanations which appear to be different, can actually be explained. And the other important point is theological essentials can be found showing the integration of all the scriptures, and many texts can be cross-referenced with each other. And one of the interesting characteristics of the Hebrew, it's a rich characteristic, and that is they have a root substructure that gives added clues to their meaning. And this carries over in name meanings of people, places, and events, which can be helpful. Brian suggested I give you two examples, and one I give, an easy one you all know, is the word hallelujah. The halal is to praise, and Yah is God. So hallelujah means to praise God. It's made up of two root connections there. And the other one is the famous figure from Genesis, Methuselah, long name, lived a long time, but his words pieced together has three roots in it that can describe his death shall send. And there is the belief that he dies just before the flood, and that after his death, the date of Noah's flood shows that's the meaning of his name. He's actually prophetically pointing to a judgment that was to come. A good example on the debate of interpretation is Isaiah 7, where a prophecy given, we're all familiar with it. Therefore, the Lord himself will give a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. The Hebrew word here is Alma, and it can mean a virgin, or it can mean a young woman of childbearing age. This became a dispute between Hebrew and Christian scholars as to the correct meaning. But the answer is solved when we check the Septuagint word for that passage in the Greek, and it uses parthenos, which is definitely a virgin. So this is where cross-referencing is a benefit with the scriptures. Now, I come to one of the most controversial things on our topic, and that is Old Testament chronology and the challenges that come on this matter. Noah's flood is a good reference point to commence any debate on chronology. And in Bible scholarship, one of the big questions is there is a difference between the Masoretic dates and those of the Septuagint, and they're quite significant differences. So, for example, from the flood to Jesus's birth in the Septuagint, it has 3,298 years, but the Masoretic has 2,348. There are little variations either side of it, but nonetheless, there is a big difference of 950 years. Now, critics of the Septuagint say this was due to pressure put on the Egyptian rabbis that were in Alexandria at the time producing the document, and the pressure on them was to come up with figures that matched the long time period of Egyptian history. And so they added extra digits to the figures in Genesis. And that's one of the proposals that criticizes them in that. Nonetheless, the Septuagint dates are very popular with archaeologists because they find it easier with the larger dates. Then when we come to the flood and the Tower of Babel dispersion, there's 530 years difference between the Septuagint and the 100 years of the Masoretic text. The Septuagint dates, to me, seem too long for the context in Genesis, so I believe the Masoretic date is more correct. Now, there are critics of the Masoretic. They say that there are some variances in their quoting of Old Testament stories, and that they had an anti-Christian bias when they were doing editing after the time of Jesus. And that is an ongoing debate that's there with scholars. I find in my research it's always helpful to read both versions, but I do favour the Masoretic. Now, in this study tonight, there's a range of dates that will be given, but I use a very good book put out by Professor Floyd Nolan Jones, an American chronologist, very experienced, and I find his computing of dates excellent, does a lot of cross-referencing, looks at historical sources, and you'll find his dates line up very much with the Protestant Bible that you have. So looking now at the unfolding of history, starting from the beginning, I believe God has always communicated through history. There's a thin red line of witnesses to God through history, persons who understand who he is, his plan of salvation, and how to live. How do we know this? The final picture at the end of age in heaven describes, after a time of tribulation, fruit coming, converts, that is, from every tribe and nation. So no one's left out from having people that come to faith. So just as that picture is there in Revelation, we're to see from Genesis right through Old Testament, it was the same. God always had people that knew him in some way, and they are in the final scheme of things also. And the other aspect in history is you get what's called an oral tradition in terms of how things are passed down to generations, and you get the written word record, which is also important to understand. So I believe the historicity of the Bible is important to defend. So taking the post-flood record of 2348 BC as our starting point, we can see that Noah and his family definitely inherit principles of Adam's laws that are there in Genesis, the principle of sacrifice, the prohibition against murder. They're all things that come down the line, and Noah would have taught that to his family, and that's there from the very beginning. They were also very aware of God's story of judgment. They were aware of the flood in those early years afterwards. But with idolatry and errors, these historical accounts, both oral and written, were corrupted into distorted legends. But it's also of interest to note that the big flood is well known in many cultures around the world, even today. So it's not just the biblical, it's there in some shape or form in people's stories. The other interesting thing with the Jews is they have a tradition, and they call it the Noahide laws. They believe that Noah's laws had characteristics that were meant for all people, including Gentiles, not just Jews. And you can look it up on the web under this heading, and you'll see the summary of, and there is in the Talmud a summary of what's called the 7 laws of Noah that made it simple for people to understand. The first one is do not worship idols. The second, do not curse God. Third, do not commit murder. 4, do not commit adultery or sexual immorality. 5, do not steal. 6, do not eat flesh from a living animal. And 7, establish courts of justice. Now, there's a bit of debate on the codifying and how that tradition passed down, but the Jews believe it's there for all humanity to benefit from it. And the interesting fact is when the early church got going with its Jewish leaders, the Gentiles came to faith and got converted. And in Acts 15, they sent 3 similar statements, very simple, what was expected of them, not a great tome of laws. It says you are to abstain from things polluted by idols, you're to abstain from sexual immorality, and you're not to eat things that have been strangled and from blood. So we see here that principle was there in the early church of keeping the laws fairly simple, understandable, that could be passed on. Now, another big debate is which is the oldest book in the Bible, and different ones have put forward, of course, Moses, but there are scholars and people who say, no, Job is the oldest history book. Now, even though there's debate, I've looked into it, and I believe when you look at it carefully, there is good support for Job being the oldest figure involved. Now, some critics imply that Job is an illustrative parable, and they plonk him in the wisdom section of the Bible. But God personally describes Job in Ezekiel 14 and Noah as real historical righteous men. So from God's perspective, they're not mythological, they're real flesh and blood figures in history. And a case can be made that Job was actually also known as Jobab, the youngest son of Joktan, who was a brother to Peleg, and they are descendants of Heber, from whom the word Hebrew comes. The spelling of the 2 names is slightly different if you look up your Strong's numbers. But in the epilogue of the Septuagint, in the Net's version, that's the new English translation of the Septuagint, it states, quote, Job died old and full of days, and previously his name was Jobab. So it supports the proposal. There is correlation possible. However, the editors of the edition I have says, as with other scholars, that the Jobab in question is actually a namesake also in Genesis of an Edomite king who definitely has the name, and also possibly a son of Issachar. I don't believe that stacks up, but that's how the scholars take this Jobab debate, because they want to have him in a later time frame. But I believe he lives to a very old age, and that's confirmed in both the Septuagint and the Masoretic accounts. And that age relates to his uncle Peleg, we mentioned previous, who lives for 239 years, showing the correlation. So doing a bit of research on dates, we can actually come up with a time zone for Job if he's very old, and that is from 2,200 years to 1960 BC. And that time zone includes the birth of Abraham, which Jones computes to 1996. So Abraham is down the track, but he's within that same zone. This puts him in the old kingdom of Egypt, and we'll see the significance of that in a minute, and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. Interestingly, Job has no reference to Abraham, Moses, or Israel, again showing an earlier understanding. Now, in the book of Job, he has a counselor, Eliphaz, from a place called Teman, and he makes two statements, and this is a question that can get asked in the context if he is an old age person. Is he making reference to Adam, and is he also referring to the wicked people of the great flood? And the two verses for us to examine and ponder is his statement to Job, are you the first man who was born, i.e. Adam, implying first person created or coming into existence, or were you brought forth before the hills? So that's the question that was put to him. And the second one is, will you keep the old way that wicked men have trod? They were snatched away before their time, and their foundation was washed away. So that aspect is there for debate. I put it there for your consideration. Now, the references to his counselors being from Teman, Shua, and Namath can be seen as redactors to get the right locations in later times. What do I mean by a redactor? Well, I'll give an example. I spent my honeymoon in Van Diemen's Land, and it was that for 200 years. But if I said that to my grandchildren, they wouldn't know where that was. I would have to explain it's now called Tasmania. And they go, oh, is that where you went? And so it's the same in the book of Job, that some of the older names were not kept. And in the editing process, they were updated further down the track. So that's where we look at it. And Teman, by the way, I believe is Little Petra in Jordan. And I can answer questions on that later if you want why I take that position. And also in Job's accounts, he describes mining and the smelting of copper very early in history, and also of iron. Very clear descriptions there of the mining process and the processing of it, showing the incredible intelligence that's there with Noah's family right from the start. He also mentions elements of what could be called a mini ice age, and there would be an ice age definitely after the flood. There is evidence for that, of course. And when you see his descriptions, it is getting pretty cold at some point in his descriptions. And he also describes uncivilized and outcast groups were also present in his region, showing that not everyone was intelligent, not everyone was in urban settlement. You had rebels there in the early centuries too. Now, Brian has pointed out a typo error here in the next point. I need to explain that Job, as you know, after his testing time, ends up remarrying later in life. After 100 years of age, he starts a new family. And it says not his granddaughters, it's his daughters that are described as beautiful after his second start. And we also have a description that Sarah, who ends up marrying Abraham, is also beautiful. So there's a 100-year gap between Job's family start, second time, and Sarah's birth. And my proposal is that could mean that 3 or 4 generations of daughters come down the line in that 100-year period, and that Sarah could actually be a great-great-granddaughter to Job, ending up marrying Abraham, and her beauty genes, if you can use that, come from Job's family. So in evidence, there's a strong tradition of God-fearing people who knew some of the history of Genesis before Moses. And Job's post-flood world includes very intelligent and industrious people. When we come to Moses, we put dates of 1490 to 1450 for where he writes. Now, the profound revelations and encounters of God to Moses was a significant event for our understanding of history. In his private tent at Mount Sinai, which I believe is Jebel Makla in Midian, and many other scholars support that also, it was actually Christ who came down onto the mountain, and it's Christ in a special form, not in human body, but Christ is manifesting himself in the tent, engaged in a very intimate conversation, mouth to mouth, as some translation put it. So Christ reveals to Moses a lot of truths there for Genesis. It's not Moses coming up with good ideas himself. He's having divine encounters, and he's the agent for us to benefit from the writing down of it. And we could also speculate and make a comment that Moses may also have had with him historic records given to him from Joseph's library, who was a leading figure in Egyptian history before Moses. Genesis is a crucial book laying foundations for many aspects of the rest of the Bible, and there are reasons why it comes under great attack in today's world. I believe it is historically and geographically reliable. It is not mythology. Controversy involves some of the time frames and its relationship to our scientific assumptions and projections. And that is a topic we've been looking at in the past, some of the debate on that. Then with Exodus, we have the story is very dramatic there with many miracles, and it became a key historic foundation for Israel to remember its covenants. Many have questioned the miracles, and even today in modern Israel, some archaeology scholars doubt its historicity. This is caused by biblical dates that conflict with conventional archaeology nominations. We'll look at this a bit later. When we come to the books of the prophets, there's many examples. There's over 60 prophets named with different testimonies and roles. But the only two I'll give you tonight is interesting timelines from Isaiah and Daniel. Now with Isaiah, his ministry starts 758 BC when King Uzziah died. And about 700 BC, he made a claim through the Holy Spirit inspiring him that eventually there would be a king whose name would be Cyrus, and he would be involved in the deliverance of God's people from exile. The challenge here is this is happening 165 years before the actual event in 536 BC. So it's a definitely God-inspired bit of information. And Cyrus is well documented as the one who gave the decree of the return of the Jews. Now, because of this, the critics come along and say, oh, that's to be explained. Some scribes put that in later when the dates became apparent. There's nothing special about it. But I believe it was a divine example of prophetic insight, and it's not a later addition. It's not a deceptive thing, in other words. This is an incredible prediction showing the sovereignty of God, and Cyrus became a key figure in the destiny of Israel. He's one of the early Persian kings, and we've got an engraving of him there from one of the sites in Persia. Now with Daniel, we're all familiar with him because he, after the fall of Babylon, had a visit from the angel Gabriel, who came to him in Shushan, in modern day Persia, that is known as Shush. And the time frame he was given for the Messiah was it would be 69 weeks multiplied by 7, giving 483 years for the coming of the Messiah, a very precise figure. And many have tried to reconcile the starting point of that period. No shortage of candidates on the calculation. But the countdown is related to a decree to rebuild the Jerusalem walls. And we get the required date when we look at 473 as the starting point, when a well-known Persian king, Artaxerxes I, had a joint reign with his father, Xerxes I. And it's actually in Greek sources that we get the more reliable computation of that, because you can see in the illustration adjacent, there was a visit by a Greek general, Themistocles, who gives a reliable starting point for the co-regency. And so when you take the 20 years off of that, you get a figure of 453 BC. And when you add 30 AD to it, you get exactly the 69 weeks of Daniel, showing Jesus's arrival at the gates of Jerusalem was spot on according to Gabriel's information. It's an amazing prediction showing the precise reliability of God. Now, this is a bit complicated, but I'm put it forward to explain an interesting thing. It's a chart comparing Middle East archaeology with timeframes, and I note at the top, I'm not bringing in the Stone Age, which are very exaggerated dates in the debate. I'm sticking to the recognised archaeological periods, starting with the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age. And if you look at the chart, just going from the top down, the oldest time period for that starts at the top with Chalcolithic, then it becomes early bronze, and I put Job in that period. And then we go to the intermediate bronze period. I put Abraham in that. Then we have the middle bronze, and in that I have the patriarchs and the Exodus stories. Then we come to the late Bronze Age, where we have the period of the Judges. Then we get the Iron Age, where we get the kingdoms of Israel. Then we go into the Babylonian and Persian, where Daniel appears. Then we have the Hellenistic, and then we have the Roman, which brings us to the time of Jesus. So that's the sequence. It comes from the Archaeological Encyclopedia of the Holy Land. I've personally met the editor of it. He's well qualified, and that's what's called the conventional dates, which are all listed in the first column, showing the sequence that they use. And with that sequence, they put sites in certain categories. But it does mean if it's not correct, you'll create errors. So when we analyze it now from a biblical position, using some of the dates computed there, what we can see is starting from the bottom of the second column, we see that the bottom 4 periods actually correlate pretty well, and there's strong agreement from the time of Jesus back to the time of King David in the Iron Age. There's not a big argument and variation in the dates. But when we move further on into the late Bronze Age, the time of the Judges, you start to get 100 to 150 year variations and arguments about what goes where. And that occurs in that middle group. And so when you're looking for Abraham and evidence of him, evidence for the Exodus, you're ending up with bigger errors. And then when we get to the really old periods, you're getting quite large variations. So on the third column there, you can see I've summarized the variations between conventional dates and biblical dates, showing why you get these arguments. So it's helpful to see those 3 divisions when we discuss the topic. So moving on now to examples. One of the first claims that needs research and consideration is, at the moment, it's very popular to talk about early primitive civilization starts in Africa. The out of Africa proposal is very popular, and they're saying that everything in the world can be traced back to Africa, and they put millions of years on it. Whereas if you read Moses, a different model, a different understanding, and a different criteria. He says it all begins in the plain of Shinar, and that there was rapid migration to Africa after the Tower of Babel dispersal in 2247 BC. But the interesting thing is modern genetics has definitely confirmed the common ancestry of humans. So even though we've got people groups all around the world, the Genome Project showed we are actually all related, and that's what Moses' accounts affirms. We all come out of Noah's family. There's also another claim that there's no evidence of the Tower of Babel. Now, I have done a previous talk on this with reasonable faith, and it's there in our video library, and that's the explanation of a site near Borsippa. Borsippa means the Tower of the Tongue, and that site is 18 kilometres southwest of historic Babylon. And I give all the argument for that as a real locality. That is where the original tower was, but it's of course now covered over and demolished. But Nebuchadnezzar built a structure very nearby, and that's how Borsippa got its name today. This tower had advanced building and metallurgy skills, so it's a big project with skilled people. But the Chaldean date for the founding of Nimrod's Babylon is interestingly close to the dates with Moses. 2034 is the date that Nimrod is given for his Babylon. Now, when we come to evidence for Hebrews in Egypt, Jones puts Abraham 1996 to 1821 BC. He leaves which is in Iraq, in 1921 BC, and then he travels and ends up in Egypt. And my proposal is the dates support he actually arrives in the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and we're told that he prays for an Egyptian pharaoh. The question is which one, and my proposal is I support the 6th dynasty as a good time frame for him, and maybe he prayed for Pharaoh Pepi II. And why do I say that? It's because Pepi has the longest recorded reign of any pharaoh. He goes for 94 years on the throne. Started very young, of course, but that's just an aside comment why I think he's a candidate. Then later on, we have Joseph arriving in Middle Kingdom Egypt, and I believe he gets elevated by Senusret I in 1750, and he's involved in saving Egypt from a famine. And he's also still alive for the later pharaoh called Amenemhet II. He's well recorded as developing the Fayum irrigation region just south of Cairo. That's still there today, that large watered area. And interestingly, on the maps of that, you'll see a reference to Bar Yusuf, which means the canal of Joseph. And Joseph is honoured in that region even today with that description that he might have had a hand in some of the works done there. He also holds the title of Vizier, which is number 2 to Pharaoh, and that's well known in Egyptian administration. Now, some say there's no evidence of the Exodus. 1491 is the date of Moses leading the people out of Egypt, and I believe it's clearly in the middle of the 13th dynasty, because soon afterwards, well recorded in Egyptian sources, that delta region was overrun by foreign Hyksos. These are not Egyptian, they're described as shepherd kings who come in, and I believe they're Amorites and Amalekites who take over the delta and create havoc in Egypt. How could they do that? They could only do that if the Egyptian army had been wiped out in the judgment in the crossing of the Red Sea. But with the elevated levels, the Egyptian date on this event is 1650. So we can see here a good example. If you have a 100-year error in your proposal, you won't match up the Moses Exodus to the right period. Another claim is there's no evidence of the Israelite invasion of the land of Canaan. That's even coming from archaeologists. Why does that happen? Well, 1451's when Joshua arranges the fall of the middle bronze 2 walls of Jericho. But when the British archaeologist Catherine Kenyon found evidence of these collapsed walls, she put an elevated date, again 100 years earlier, of 1550. So she said it's not Joshua collapsing the walls, it must have been a bunch of Amorites coming by that attacked it and pulled the walls down. So I believe we're getting a bit of a pattern here of why we're getting these anomalies. If you get a wrong date with the wrong evidence, you'll come to a wrong conclusion. Then there's the question of evidence of King Solomon's grand reign, and we're told during his reign, Jerusalem was incredibly wealthy with a lot of gold and silver. But where is it today? Where's the evidence? And we can date his reign to 1015 to 975 BC, and we're told after he died in 971, his kingdom was invaded by an Egyptian pharaoh called Shishak, and that Shishak actually stripped the temple in Jerusalem of its wealth. Now, he has been identified with a well-known Egyptian pharaoh called Sheshonq I in the dynasty 22, and his conventional reign is 943 to 922 BC. Now, when you compare the two dates, there's only 28 years difference between the Masoretic date and the Egyptian date, showing the correlation. There are hieroglyphs of his campaign in Israel, but no mention of the conquering of Jerusalem. But there is evidence of his huge plunder of the city. How do we know that? Well, a well-known archaeologist, historian, Kenneth Kitchen, has done a calculation of the son of Sheshonq, and he calculated he received 283 tons of gold and silver that got deposited in different temples in Egypt. So his question is, where did all the gold and silver come from? Well, I believe the father involved was the explanation there. So in summary, Bible timeframes can be related to historical events. The difference in some older accounts have inflated dates allocated. Now, Scott, just some summary comments. Scholars agree that there's errors in some of the assumptions with the developed Egyptian chronologies. It's been proposed that the Assyrian chronologies are closer to the biblical dates more than the Egyptian. Historical chronologies usually cite a range of dates described as upper and lower, showing divergent interpretations. There are often different theories and opinions from scholars on proposals. The Bible provides a reliable framework to consider historical investigations. There have been many archaeological confirmations of sites and historical persons. The Gospels provide the sequence connecting Adam back to the birth, from Adam down to the birth of Jesus, and the Masoretic texts are helpful in proposing a chronology. So, Brian, I recommend we move on from this slide. That's just introducing the New Testament, where I affirm that there's a lot of support for its reliability, and the debate is more with the chronology of Jesus's life. So I think we'll move now, in view of our time, to the last two slides, where I put forward a proposal. When you go into the research on Jesus's life, there's no shortage of candidates for the start of his life and whether he's crucified in 30 AD or 33 AD. I'm proposing here that all the information can be coordinated chronologically once you get what's happening in each period, and there are scholars giving support. So the first criticism, and there's no evidence of an empire-wide census, that's the Roman Empire census, in the required time period. Also, no proof that Quirinius was ruling in Syria in this period. But what we need to do to look at the explanation is our period is from 8 to 7 BC was the year of an empire-wide census of Augustus. Now, the Romans definitely had empire ones very wide every 14 years. The interesting thing is, with this date, this was a time when Herod was conducting a war against the Nabatean Arabs. This obviously would have delayed the start of the census because the Nabateans had extensive trade networks in Judea and had a major shipping port of Gaza as part of their network. So the whole geography would require that the census could not go ahead with people traveling around back to Judea while a war is being conducted. Quirinius is a well-known figure, well documented. He's actually a military governor appointed directly by Augustus to fight a rebellious tribe in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. His base was Antioch, the Roman capital in Syria, but he had a joint rule there with a civic governor. So you got one civic, one military joint rule in there. So why is Quirinius named in our description in Luke? Quirinius was actually responsible for Roman security in this first census. And the interesting thing is when you take the 8 BC date and then take off the 14 years to the next one, you get to 6 AD, which is a time of a well-known census, and Quirinius is actually named in that as the sole governor of Judea. So there is correlation on the censuses once you understand the time frame and what was happening in Judea, which means eventually the census got going after the security got sorted out, and we can put February 5 BC for when the angel Gabriel visits the Virgin Mary at Nazareth. The incarnation occurs perhaps a week after that, and we also are told that Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant at the same time, which then brings us to Jesus being born in Bethlehem 9 months later. So the correct Christmas is, I believe, the end of November 5 BC, and the wise men 4 weeks later, having seen the star of his birth, arrived there to worship him. Then in January 4 BC, we have, after Mary's reaches her purification period, Jesus gets dedicated in the temple. We're told in one of the gospel accounts they return to Nazareth, but several months later, they're warned by an angel they have to flee to Egypt. So this very 4-month, maybe 4 or 5 month old baby is taken down into Egypt to escape the politics happening in Jerusalem. Now, there is debate about Herod's time of death and about the massacre, but I believe in May 3 BC, earlier in that year, Herod ordered a secret register of boys under 2 years in the Bethlehem region to be discovered. It was all done secretly, and the massacre of the boys was done in a secret location. The reason I take that position is that there's no evidence in all the journals regarding Herod's life of him conducting a massacre, but with the person that he was, it wouldn't be a surprise for him to do a massacre in secret. He even killed some of his own family members, so it's not impossible that that description of a massacre occurred. And there is scholarly evidence that a good date for his death is in between January to March 1 BC. We're told from Josephus he dies just after an eclipse, which occurred on January 10 and before Passover. So that gives support for the later death of Herod. Then later on in 4 AD, Joseph and his family get the okay to go back to Israel, but they don't go to Bethlehem because Archelaus, Herod's son, is now ruling and he's quite tyrannical. They go back to Nazareth to start a new life. Now, the next date that's important to us, 11 AD, Tiberius starts a co-regency with Augustus, his stepfather, and that's supported by a well-credentialed Roman historian, Theodore Mommsen. He says 11 AD is a good starting date, which gives us the clue for when Jesus gets baptized, which is September 26 AD. And we're told in the Gospels that baptism is just before he turns 30. And with the dates I've given you, it's just before his birthday. He gets baptized by John, and a good time would have been in the Jewish festival week in September. And that's the start of his 3.5 years of ministry. And the clue from Luke is getting that right, Tiberius reign period. We then get in the following year, in September 27 AD, the Jubilee year, which Jones supports as a correct date for a Jubilee. Jesus stands up in the Nazareth synagogue declares liberty to the captives. So it all synchronizes perfectly. And then we come to April in 30 AD, where Jesus is crucified and resurrected. That means his age is 30 years and 4 months. And it also means in 7 years' time, we'll be celebrating the 2000th anniversary. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity of sharing.
So feel free to unmute. Yeah, there are a few things in the chat here, Trevor. So thank you very much for that talk. From Bronwyn, is there any archaeological evidence for King Solomon considering his wealth, prestige and building in the era? Did you want to ask any more, say anything more about that, Bronwyn, before I hand it over to Trevor?
I suppose you did reference King Solomon, but what about his mines? Wasn't there like a lot of reference to King Solomon's mines?
Yeah.
Surely that would show up somewhere, you would think.
Yeah, well, the problem with King Solomon's mines is there's about 4 or 5 sites that get offered. Some have it in Africa, some have it in Arabia, some even have it further over towards India. So your problem there is there's definitely mines in all those areas. It's a case of which one is Solomon's. But there is a clue with Solomon in that he's actually trading from a wide group of people, because he has these big ships that come into what's modern day Eilat, which is a port even today on the Red Sea Gulf. And there is evidence that that was a trading place where stuff could arrive from different parts of the globe. There's hints in the description of his, what do you call it, palace grounds, that he's got peacocks and certain animals, apes, and they're described implying that they could have even come from India. And there is this idea that it is a fairly magnificent empire he has. Regarding archaeology in Solomon, as you know, the big issue is, did he build the temple on Temple Mount? And that is, again, an interesting question. There is evidence, I believe, of a temple being there, and I believe it was definitely Solomon that did it, but it all got flattened, as you know, by the Romans. And Jesus said not one stone would be left. And why was that? Well, that temple done by Herod later had a lot of gold in it. They had gold sheeting on the front and all around, and they had very, elaborate stuff in their ornamentation. Roman soldiers who had just fought a horrendous campaign, because the Jewish resistance was pretty fierce, they were pretty angry. They wanted payback, and they ended up literally pulling every stone down looking for gold. So there's not much there, but there's definite evidence under Temple Mount of cisterns and what you would call supporting structures for a massive complex on top of it. And there are definitely Solomon sites at Megiddo and other places around Israel where the gateways and the walls of the city are quite massive, showing that they're well constructed. And the other one, of course, in Jerusalem, there is evidence of Iron Age walls in Jerusalem. And they, of course, get flattened by the Babylonians and have to get rebuilt by Nehemiah. So a lot of it, Solomon stuff, with the test of time, not a lot got left. But the reference to Sheshonk's interesting. Where do you get 480 tons of gold? That's a lot of melting down. And when you hear the description, he had a lot of gold there. Just a little throwaway comment. I have a proposal on traditional Mount Zion where I believe he established a zoo where all these animals he's getting from India or in Africa. I believe Solomon, he's very intelligent. I believe he's actually a scientist, a Renaissance man who took an interest in architecture, in animals and plants, and he's a source of wisdom. So when it says the kings and queens visit him, he's got a working laboratory, come museum, come botanical garden on the big hill in the centre of Jerusalem.
Is there any reference in other places in the world of kings saying they've visited him? You know, in their writings.
No, not that I'm aware of. The one that's very interesting, which I looked at today to refresh my brain, is the Queen of Sheba visiting from down in what's now called Eritrea, I believe, ancient Sheba. And it's a very strong tradition in the Ethiopian church and different sources, including the Quran, who support that that's based on history. There was a real queen who had an interest in the wisdom of Solomon, who went there. And the other factor supporting is Jesus actually makes reference to that visit of the queen, saying she will rise up in judgment of this generation. Now, what does that mean? What Jesus is saying is you've got the Messiah running around Israel and no rabbis coming and asking for advice. But here's a queen who's a Gentile many miles away, sorry, kilometers, showing my age, coming all that way to ask questions of Solomon. And I believe she gets converted by Solomon. He witnesses to her about the true God. So that's why she's there in the last day as a witness. I believe she's one of the examples of a God-fearing person influenced by Solomon.
If I may, Trevor, I believe there was a mention at Gumzate about 900 BC of someone, it might have been an Assyrian letter, talking about someone in the region of Israel and talking about the son of Dawood, interpretation, translation of David. So even though Solomon may not get as much, there is a recognition that son of David, the king's line established by David was recognised in a foreign country, adjacent foreign country, around about 900 BC.
Yeah, that's true. David's name is definitely there in Israel, just like Israel is named there as well. So, I'd be interested in following up on that, Stephen. So, which country do you think that was?
Oh, look, it might have been the Assyrians. I'd have to go back and check on the facts, but I recollect it was one of the scholars' Bible study handbook that brought that out.
Right.
Another detail, I'm not sure quite how much credence we place on it, but right up to and including the last century, the kings or emperors of Ethiopia called themselves, I think it was the line of the tribe of Judah. Implication being that there was a sexual relationship between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, starting a line that went on from there.
I've heard that before, yes. Haile Selassie.
Yeah.
The line of Judah.
That's right. Yeah, the sexual one is definitely there in all the traditions and stories, and it's been debated. But when you look at Solomon's track record, I think he had a few.
He had 900 concubines. I think one more relationship would hardly matter.
But surely they would have been Jewish women.
Oh no! Read the end of the book of Kings, or the Kings.
All right, okay.
These other women drew him away by worshipping their gods. He built idol, temples to them on the Mount of Olives, and that's unfortunate. Very
history
sad.
shows if you have more than one wife, it ends in catastrophe.
Exactly.
I think that's a topic for another day.
The other one, Bronwyn, you need to be aware, it's well documented that Pharaoh gave a daughter to Solomon very early on, and Solomon built a house for Pharaoh's daughter. Now, in the course of that time, it was very common for political reasons for that to happen, because when you're trading and developing diplomatic relationships, you want to, maximize your influence, and that's how they did it.
Yeah.
Now, the other three comments in the chat are all from Stephen. So just wondering if you want to take it from there, Stephen.
Yeah, I'll hopefully go straight through it. The first one I mentioned at the beginning of last year when we entered into the debate about young Earth or old Earth, and I made the point that the Jewish, and I'm trying to think of the title of the writings, that this was written about 135 AD. There was another great rising against Rome, Shimon bar Kokhba, son of the Star, who tried to throw off the Romans, and the rabbi of the day designated him to be the Messiah. And when they came to write out, I guess it was almost a timeline of history, it was written shortly after that, the rabbi of the day, and I get it if necessary, wrote the timeline that truncated Persian history so that the 79 years, or 69 by 7, came out to match Shimon bar Kokhba as the designated Messiah from Daniel chapter 9. So that's one thing. Did you have any comment on that, Trevor?
Yeah, that guy is Akiva, I think, Rabbi.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Rabbi in that rebellion period, and yes, he was promoted as a false. He was promoted as the Messiah, but he was definitely a false one, which Jesus warned the disciples that they would have that problem to deal with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, they certainly recognise Artaxerxes that you've mentioned as the starting point. They just shortened the intervening years so that it went past the time that we know when Jesus was crucified.
Just on that, there's a question mark over whether we're talking solar years or lunar years here too.
Yeah. Well, elsewhere in Daniel, 360 days is the common prophetic year.
This is a good example where we're all got the same problem of interpretation. Is it solar? Is it lunar? When you go into it, the solar is quite reliable with the information I gave you, and the solar is actually common to all the cultures. Only some of them use the lunar one, and part of the pressure was to get it to match. Everyone agreed it had to have something to do with Jesus. So as I mentioned in my talk, there's many ways you can try and, to some degree, jig the figures. But what I'm trying to show in this presentation tonight, because of the debate about the issue, is when you get the right co-regency with Artaxerxes one and take off the 20 years, you do get from the Greek sources a good starting point that perfectly matches. So you don't have to play around with the lengths of the years. You just do a straight computation based on solar years.
Yeah, related to that also is the fact that the Jews in the time of Jesus were specifically expecting Messiah at that time, because it's got records of them going to John the Baptist and saying, "Are you the Messiah? Are you he?" And they were specifically looking at that time for the Messiah. So then they dated it to that time.
Yeah, good point. That's very true, Brian. The expectation was there amongst the scholars.
Yeah. Okay, if I may, on slide 18, we talked about the walls of Jericho, but obviously just prior to that, we have the crossing of the Jordan. And there's certainly historic records of a particular part of the Jordan comes close to a cliff face, and that has dammed a number of times over the last 1,000 years. We know when and where it all happened, just upstream, perhaps 20 kilometres upstream from where we believe that the Jews crossed the Jordan. So that is physically, geophysically, quite an established event. It easily have happened. It was the timing, which was a miracle.
Yeah, I do have a controversial comment on that. Yes. You may have gathered from my talk, I take a high view of Scripture.
Yes.
In that I believe miracles are miracles. And
yes.
The power of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
And my proposal is that in the case of stopping the Jordan, Joshua arranged for the Levite priests to carry the ark, and they're told to walk into the water. And it says the waters stopped, and I believe a spiritual wall was created just in front of where the ark was. And that damming action was a miracle event. And we're told that 12 stones were taken out of where the ark was and placed over in Gilgal. And then they were to take 12 stones back from Gilgal to plonk in the bed of the Jordan River. And I believe there's a prophetic action going on here, in that it wouldn't surprise me. There's some reference to later on where John the Baptist does his baptism of Jesus, could have some connection to that same locality, because it's, you know, the miracle work of the Spirit, the people of God entering the land with a miracle, and now we got the kingdom of God starting with the baptism of Jesus. So I do take a view it's miraculous, Stephen, but I am familiar with the cliff falling in the river, and there are different scholars that push that line. But I think in the debate,
it's a historic record. It has dammed. I can give you the dates of when it's dammed. And if I go back to the curses on Egypt, you know, something like the great hailstorm, etc. Yes, you know, the timing was a miraculous thing, but many of those curses on Egypt, judgments of Egypt, were in fact physical occurrences which we're familiar with. Timing-wise, no, that was the miracle.
Also,
Sorry, and finally, if I may, just on the date of the Tower of Babel. In fact, 2014, I gave a similar talk to you, but perhaps somewhat varied, on why I believe the Old Testament timescale. And a year earlier, 2013, Secular Source, the Evolutionary Institute of Leipzig, had done a DNA sampling of people from India, people from Papua New Guinea, and people from the Australian Aborigines. And they got 11% match of the inherited DNA. And these days, we know the rate at which inherited DNA changes. And quite without giving any reference to the timing of the Tower of Babel, they said that was about 4,200 years ago. There was a major interaction between Indians, Papua New Guineans, and the Australian Aborigines. Now, of course, fortunately, I'm seeing the ads going on TV about the voice debate, and they say, we've been here for 60,000 years. I'm sorry, that's not what inherited DNA is saying. There was quite a probability. There was a major interaction about 4,200 years ago. Just have a look back at the Bible. That's almost exact. Well, we don't get an exact date for the Tower of Babel unless you know one, Trevor, but to me, 4,200 is just about as close as I could have imagined.
Yeah, that is interesting. Another example recently is they found a tribe in the Amazon jungle that was classed as Stone Age with its technology, very, very old. And anyway, they did the analysis of the DNA and looked at it. And then they were a bit shocked to find that there's correlation between their DNA and Australian Aboriginal DNA. Yes. And the question was asked, how can that be? And where did they come from? And how do you explain it?
Well, obviously there is debate, but look, as I say, where possible, I'll always use a secular institute to inform me, because obviously people would blame us for our biblical bias, but the secular institute tells me 4,200 years ago. Yep, I can accept it.
There is, just as an aside on that too, you know, in the DNA debate, that someone has written and said most of Europe can be explained by, I think it's about 20 clan mothers,
yes,
which they use as the common motherhood thing. So when you look at the women on the ark, it gives again support that there is this correlation.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, you know, I've had my bit, and I'll let others take their say.
Someone else's turn, and if you need to say something, you're muted, unmute first.
Stephen mentioned the city of Jericho. I'm not sure whether it was one of the reasonable faith episodes, but was there not considerable doubt about the existence of this town? Is it possible that that it was just turned into rubble and nothing can be found?
No, the evidence, I've been there, Tel Sultan
Yes.
in modern day Jericho, well-known archaeological site, well documented on the western side of major collapse of walls and evidence of extensive burning. That's definitely there. So that's where Joshua gets the people to march around for it to happen. So Jerry, but in terms of your question about desolation, it was cursed as a site. They were told not to rebuild it. And for many years, it was left uninhabited. And there's a little bit of evidence later, and it is in the Bible, a chap called Hiel, Hiel, who did some efforts to try and rebuild it in a later period, but they didn't amount to much in the way of archaeology. And that is recorded. There was an effort, but it definitely had a curse on it, according to the biblical account.
Hmm.
You look like you wanted to say something, Luke.
If I may, just
No.
on that point, Trevor, of course, it's an important point too for arguing for, I think it's a seeming contradiction in the New Testament between, I think it's Luke and maybe Matthew, about when blind Bartimaeus was healed. One says as he was entering Jericho, and the other one says as he was leaving Jericho, the blind people. But of course, there's two different sites. You've got the old ruins of Jericho, and then you've got the new city of Jericho, which was a little bit further south. And so both match it, but one could be interpreted as the old ruins of Jericho. The other account was as they're entering the newer rebuilt city of Jericho, rebuilt by Herod, I think it was.
Yeah, that's correct. There is the old and the new. The reason for the new is Herod actually had a big palace complex and a headquarters there, and he put a lot of money into Jericho, and that was the newer in the time of Jesus one, as against the more historic locality.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what I'm saying in all the research on these debates of contradiction, there's often an explanation once you dig into the facts on either time issues, geography issues. There's always a reason, because at the end of the day, the truth is the truth is the truth. And if the Bible claims to have truth, we should take note of it and try harder to see how there's another explanation for things. But going back to the Jericho one, I was in contact with one of the archaeologists, and the question came up about this debate about dates. And they're pretty entrenched. Once someone says, well, it was 1550, the walls fell over. And I say, well, hang on, you can reconsider and look at it 100 years later, and there's plenty of evidence that is how it happened. They get a bit defensive because you're actually attacking their worldview and their schema.
Yes.
I'm curious as to why or how the Jewish scholars look at some of the prophecies that have been fulfilled that might reflect Christ, and how they argue against it. You've got an opinion on that? Like, if there's a lot of prophecies that have been fulfilled in the Bible, and a lot of them predict Jesus very accurately, and they're looking for a Messiah. I'm a bit flabbergasted why they wouldn't, more Jewish scholars wouldn't say, actually, I think he might be the one. You know, like, is that what happens? Or
yeah, very good question. And I've travelled there 6 or 7 times now, and it always intrigues me that are people that take, still to this day, they have schools looking at scripture. They learn it off by rote in some classes. The whole undergirding of their culture, the language, everything, the history. You would think surely you would ask the question which you're raising, Bronwyn. But as Paul more or less hints, there's like a spiritual veil come on it, and you can use all the logic in the world, and you know, it's a little bit like our challenge. You know, we've got a lot of scientific evidence to show it's intelligence in creation, and you can say to someone there has to be a God because of the intelligence, and they say no, it can still happen by accident. You know, it's okay. You know, and you say, well, shouldn't you at least ask the question? A bit like that. Who was it? The famous British guy with these programs on nature. I've forgotten his name.
I know you mean. Yeah.
But he was asked many times how he didn't believe in God, having looked at it all, and you know, he just said he couldn't accept him.
Or in this case, you were talking earlier about that prophecy in Daniel. Whether you believe the dates, as in the chronology there, it still comes down to a reasonably small period, which by now has long expired. So it's pretty obvious that there's some issue there.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, the whole explaining of the cutting off of the Messiah, the dealing with sin, the righteousness that's to come after, it's all there. It's very, very clear, but there is a blindness problem. Perhaps I could throw in a comment here. What is interesting, though, is these Messianic Jews that are popping up in Israel now. And there is a prayer movement there where they set up houses of prayer. And once they get the scriptures and with their Jewish culture, they become very dynamic in their, and quite courageous too, because they get hammered on all sides with the position that they take once they become Messianic Jews.
That's probably similar to what, well, probably Muslims that become Christians can get a lot of persecution, but they do have I think an edge on their Christian outlook, which I think supersedes ours. You know, they seem to have that deep belief that just it's become, and I suppose they're a bit more religious in the way they do things, and that can be an advantage. You know, you look like prayer. You know, shall I pray this morning? No, I'm feeling a bit tired. You know, right? So I won't. But they discipline themselves that they just don't get away with it. You know.
Yeah. For a Muslim, they have to be very convinced to leave Islam to become Christians. And it's such a major thing for them that they have to be totally convinced. And if they are totally convinced, then that's it for them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, Bronwyn. When I was driving around Jordan doing research, we had to stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and I get out of the car, and suddenly I could hear this wailing sound coming from the bushes, and it was someone praying in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't even see him. So I went back to my Muslim guide and I said, what's that guy doing? He said, yeah, he's praying. It's the right time for him. I said, but there's no one here. He says, it doesn't matter. He's obligated in the middle of nowhere to stop and pray at a certain time. No one looking at him to check that he's doing it. And I thought, how many of us as Christians would have an excuse why? Oh, well.
That's right. Yeah.
Different culture.
Yeah, they did put us to shame.